Welcome to the National Council for History Education Conference. We're so excited to have you here on this beautiful campus of Flagler College. We'd like to recognize Dr. Bill Hebert, the president of Flagler College, who's here in the audience. We're really right down in the center. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you for this beautiful, beautiful location. We're really grateful to be here. As a Floridian, I'm thrilled to be have NCHE here in St. Augustine. I serve as the conference committee chair on the board of trustees. My name is Laura Wakefield, and it's such a perfect time for NCHE to be here in St. Augustine with the 450th commemoration of its founding, and NCHE is having a birthday as well. It's our 25th anniversary, and we're just so excited that we've made it 25 years as an organization. And tonight we'll be celebrating in the Colonial Quarter at the Friday night event. There are still a few tickets left. If you would like to come and hadn't bought a ticket, we'd love to have you come and celebrate with us NCHE's birthday in that wonderful Colonial Quarter. We also wanted to remind you, like you, I'm passionate about history education, and this is a wonderful opportunity to connect with colleagues and those who are like-minded about history. And so what I encourage you to do is to download the app that's free, and you can connect with your colleagues there and post things on social media. We do have a hashtag NCHE 2015. We hope you will do that, share what you're learning, your insights, and the experiences you're having with your colleagues who are both here and those who weren't able to come, so that they'll be excited about coming in the future. And finally, we also, as a fundraiser, we have a wonderful raffle that we are doing in the exhibit hall, and there are some amazing prizes. You can look in your program booklet on page 32 to see what some of those things are, and I encourage you to take part in that, including, for example, a trip conference to the conference in Niagara Falls next year with the hotel paid for and things like that. There's Kindle, Paperwhite, all kinds of wonderful things. So take a look at those when you go in the exhibit hall today for lunch after this meeting. But at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dale Steiner, who is the chair of the NCHE board.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you all for coming out. I want to thank Laura particularly because she's not only vice chair of NCHE, but she's also our conference committee chair. It was her idea to have the conference here, and we couldn't be happier. And I'm sure, particularly if you're from the Northeast, you couldn't be happier to be in Florida. It's snowing up there again, right? I thought I'd start today by posing at least a rhetorical question, which is, what does today's speaker, Cokie Roberts, have in common with Hank Aaron, David McCullough, Dolly Parton, Colin Powell, Steven Spielberg, Gloria Steinem, and Larry Bird, other than the fact that not one of them came to my birthday party last year? I bet you can't answer that question. Well, they've all been named living legends by the Library of Congress. And according to the Library of Congress, so you're still alive. Yeah. According to the Library of Congress, that's an award that honors those who've made significant contributions to America's diverse cultural, scientific, and social heritage, and whose professional accomplishments have enabled them to provide examples of personal excellence that have benefited others and enriched the nation in a variety of ways. And when you reflect on that description, you'll recognize that that's a really high bar, and yet it's one that Cokie Roberts clears easily. Current listeners to NPR's Morning Edition and viewers of ABC's This Week are familiar with her insightful political comments, although in fact her broadcasting career stretches back over 40 years. Sorry. And has resulted in 3 Emmys as well as numerous other awards. In addition, avid readers among you, and I assume that's lots of you, know her as an author whose books have soared to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. What you may not know, though, is that Cokie is a member of NCHE's Board of Directors, and we are happy that she is. She has a long-standing interest in history, particularly the history of the United States, and I strongly suspect that this audience would be particularly interested in a couple of her books, Founding Mothers, The Women Who Raised Our Nation, and Ladies of Liberty, The Women Who Shaped Our Nation. As their titles suggest, both books detail the public and private lives of women who, to greater and lesser degrees, influenced the social, political, and economic life of revolutionary America and the early republic. At the same time, though, she notes rather pointedly, there's nothing unique about them. They did, with great hardship, courage, pluck, prayerfulness, sadness, joy, energy, and humor, what women do. I know that as historians, you're all about the past, but here's some good news about the future. Her next book, Capital Dames, Women in Washington in the Civil War, 1848 to 1868, will be in bookstores in less than 4 weeks. And we're not mathematicians, but I'm pretty sure 2 weeks is less than 4 weeks. But so you've heard her on the radio, you've seen her on television, you've lied about reading her books. Won't you please join me in welcoming NCHE's own living legend, Cokie Roberts.
Well, thank you. That was a lovely introduction. I actually never knew what a living legend was, so the living part was what I did concentrate on. But it's great to be here. This is a wonderful conference, and I'm just distressed that I have family obligations that I have to leave right away because I want to go to every single one of the workshops. They all look fascinating, and the pub crawl looks particularly nice. And I have always wanted to come to St. Augustine. And here it is, 450. My family came to Jamestown, and I have always told the snobby members that that St. Augustine was really here first, and they don't even want to hear it. You know, I mean, it's very funny how they just kind of ignore that fact. Well, it was Spanish. Well, that actually counts, but. And I'm especially glad to be here with you. Because really you're doing the Lord's work. Teaching history is so incredibly important. There's absolutely no way of understanding this country and what's happening today without understanding history. And the fact that we don't know it is, I mean, in some tiny way it's a good thing because it means that we're not fighting the same battles with our, you know, the people from the opposite religion that have been fighting for 1,000 years, and that's what a distortion of history can do. But it also means that we don't understand, we can't put things in context if we don't know what's going on historically. And so I think it's just so important to keep alive not only our history, but also the importance of teaching history and making sure that the powers that be, who often don't have a clue themselves, as you well know, that they understand the absolutely crucial nature of this. And, you know, and then when you finally do get to a point where you can convince people that teaching history is important, then you start teaching it and they say, oh, not that history, you know. So I really, really respect and admire what you do, and I'm sorry not to be able to spend more time just visiting with you because I know I would learn a lot. I have, apparently I see in the program that my title for this talk is The Second Half of History. Something must have gotten, you know, lost in translation. Every so often my New Orleans accent comes back and people don't know what I'm saying. But I would have never called it the second half. First would have been fine, but other, certainly. But I think it's, what I'm really talking about is the fact that I don't think that we can really know history, have a complete knowledge of history, if we leave out half of the human race, called women. And that happens way, way too often. I had a children's book, actually, Dale has it here. There we go, a children's book of founding mothers, come out last year. And I went around to schools in lots of different places, and it was a lot of fun, you know, talking to these kids. They say, as you know, just fabulous things. But so I'd say to them, you know, those pictures of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and all of that, do you think anything's missing from those pictures? And the little boys would always say something just totally wacky, you know. Well, there's some symbol. What are you talking about, you know? And finally, some little girl would raise her hand and say, women, they're no women in anything we see. And I'd say to them, well, do you think there were women then? And they'll get all giggly, you know, because it implies sex. And they'd say, well, yes, there were women then. How do you know? And they'd say, well, because you couldn't have men without women. True story. I really feel strongly that, you know, the pictures need to be there as well, and certainly the stories. And the truth is that it is so, the stories are so not only important, but they're so much fun. In this book that's coming out in a few weeks, the Mrs. Senator Crittenden, which is the way they describe themselves, you know, Mrs. Senator, Mrs. Secretary, they didn't have names. She was telling the younger women in Washington in the 1850s why she was perfectly happy. And she said, my first marriage was for love, and it was mine as fully as I could wish. My second for money, and heaven was good to me in this instance. My third was for position, and that too is mine. What more could I ask? Now, that would have given me a good giggle under any circumstances, but having it come from a mid-19th century woman, of course, makes me laugh out loud, because it's so unexpected. And we have such distorted views of them, pictures of them. And some of it just has to do with fashion, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that we don't know them. They haven't been there. They haven't been part of our American story. And of course, when you get to have the opportunity to do the research into that story, what you find while the men were off thinking great thoughts or fighting for union or slavery or against, that the women were also very involved, but what you get is a much franker, more unvarnished view of the current events of the time. And I think that's particularly true of the founding era, when the men were so self-aware. They knew that what they were doing was important and different and world-shattering. And so they were conscious of everything they wrote. They knew if they won, that they would go down in history, and that they therefore wrote with that in mind. Their letters are careful, they're edited, they're pompous, and that's just simply not true in the women's letters, and it's not even true in the letters of the men to women. You know, the letters to each other carry so much weight of posterity that I feel like their letters are written by the marble and bronze statues that we see of them, you know, rather than the men themselves. But I think that you get, when you look at them through the eyes of women, that you get a broader view, because not only does it include the other half of the human race, but the men become much more three-dimensional. They become human. They become flesh and blood as the fathers, husbands, lovers, friends of the women. And they have passion and playfulness, and their flaws and their feelings come through in a way that is just simply not there when you read the kind of official histories that they meant for you to read, that they left behind. I mean, to whom but his wife would John Marshall, the great jurist, have written when he was off riding the circuit in the one-horse town of Raleigh, North Carolina at the time, that he had gotten there without any breeches? And he said, I immediately set out to get a pair made. I thought I should be a sans-culotte only one day. But the tailors were, such as they were so busy that I have the extreme mortification to pass the whole term without that important article of dress I have mentioned. I mean, what was he wearing? You know, every time I pass a portrait of him, which in Washington happens, you know, I sort of avert my gaze because I'm wondering what's going on under that robe. And, but you know he wouldn't have written that to George Washington. It was John Quincy Adams even, who is certainly not your fun and games guy. He alluded to the difference of the way that men write to men and the way they write to women. In one of his letters to his wife Louisa, she was back in St. Petersburg, where he was the ambassador, and he was traveling to Ghent to negotiate the treaty to end the War of 1812, and got stuck for a while in Lithuania, what's now Estonia, what's now Estonia, and was sort of writing her all these very funny letters. And he said, there's so much gossiping in my letters to you that if the inspectors of the post office at the capital take the trouble of opening and reporting them to the government, my diplomatic gravity and dignity will be furieusement compromise. So he understood that these were a different view of history than they did with each other. And they also were much less guarded, not just about their personal foibles and the foibles of other men, but also they were much franker and more honest in their political judgments. So in 1814, when Congressman William Lowndes believed that Adams and the other peace negotiators would fail, and that the war would, that they would succeed and that the war would soon end. He wrote that to his wife and said, it is indeed very important that our exertions should not be weakened by the opinion that they may be unnecessary. Yet the hope in which I sometimes indulge myself, I cannot refuse to communicate to you. So he didn't want to let out that he thought that there might be a peaceful solution because he wanted people to fight on. But he could say it to his wife. And so the judgment was a more honest judgment than he was willing to give to the other men or to the press. And that is another part that is just much more complete. And of course, the women's letters themselves are just a complete treat. They are so much more lively and fun and frank, and we hear everything from them, from politics to pregnancy, and we see history from a very different perspective. We learn not just what wars were fought on the battlefield, but what was happening on the deprivations often felt on the home front. And we know not just about the men who were meeting in Philadelphia to craft the charters at the time, but about the women in Boston and Charleston and Richmond who were bearing and often burying those men's children, and all too often burying them, and caring for their mothers, while they were also still doing a lot of political reporting from the cities and the colonies back to the men who were meeting in the Congress. We learn not just about the diplomatic missions of the statesmen serving abroad, but also what the women observed of the cultures of foreign countries, so that you can see how America was viewing the world in a different way from their letters, and what they gleaned, what the women were gleaning in court circles, which was very different from what the men were learning. And they also recount affairs of state in one sentence and then describe what everybody's wearing in the next. And so it's a lot of fun to read, but it's also a more complete sense of the time, because you get sort of a social history, an economic history, a cultural history, as well as the political history. And they tell you things that the men would never tell you. I mean, what man would report, as Louisa Catherine Adams did at the end of the congressional session in 1820? It was the year of the Missouri Compromise, and Congress stayed in session much longer than anyone expected. And so it was getting to be really rough. Washington was getting hot, people were getting sick, they were running out of ice. Finally, Congress goes home, and she goes to a meeting of the trustees of the Orphan Asylum. This was an asylum that Dolly Madison and the women of Washington had established after the War of 1812 to take care of the female orphans who had been left behind by the invasion of Washington. And she goes to a meeting of the trustees, and one says that they're going to need a new building that year. And she said, why? What are you talking about? And the woman says, Congress having left many females in such difficulties as to make it probable they would beg our assistance. And Mrs. Adams asked for an explanation and got the answer. The session had been very long. The fathers of the nation had left 40 cases to be provided for by the public, and that our institution was the most likely to be called upon to maintain this illicit progeny. 40 pregnant women left behind by Congress. Now, the Congress only had a couple of hundred members at the time. Now, they might have been recidivist, I don't know, but at any rate, she was writing these letters home to old John Adams, who was sad. Abigail had died, and she was giving him all the good gossip to keep him amused. And she says to him, just outraged, she says, I recommended a petition to Congress next session for that great and moral body to establish a foundling institution, and should certainly move that the $2 additional a day which they have given themselves as an increase in pay may be appropriated as a fund toward the support of the institution. Now, honestly, it doesn't get any better than that. I mean, when I came upon that letter had never been published. And when I came upon it, I just couldn't believe it, you know. And I was working in the basement. I came running upstairs to my husband, and I said, read this, you know. Does this say what I think it says? And he said, oh, yeah. He was duly shocked, which I loved. Her daughter-in-law, Abigail Brooks Adams, almost 50 years later, was in Washington for the famous 36th Congress, you know, before secession. And she said, the Senate behaved like children, and silly ones at that. Anything new under the sun? And her husband was in the House, of course, and the animus between the House and Senate is famous, you know, never across the dome shall you meet. But she, in the House, she had a different complaint, which she says, the other side all go armed and put their hands to their breast upon the slightest provocation. You know, they were shooting each other. And I always, you know, people are always asking me, is this the most partisan time ever? And I say, no, they're not shooting each other, and, you know, that's an improvement, I guess. Although, I said once, you know, metal detector's good, and somebody said to me, actually, can we get rid of them? You know, it wasn't a great view of Congress, but then that's where the public is these days. But and really, they shot each other all the time. You know, we always talk about Burr Hamilton, but it was just the most famous. And think about it, Aaron Burr was the sitting vice president of the United States when he murdered his political enemy over political speech. And you know, our most recent vice president did have a problem with a gun, but as far as I know. But you know, very few of Abigail Brooks Adams' letters have ever been published. I mean, I got them, thankfully, from the Massachusetts Historical Society, scanned in longhand, and then found somebody who could read them with younger eyes than I, and they're fabulous. And not only are they politically astute, she refers to Buchanan repeatedly as that pig, but And she does say, she's writing them to Henry Adams, and she does say, but it would be hard, you know, I'd go to jail if anybody read my letters, basically. But she also says, and I love this, it's so funny, I would advise any young woman who wishes to have an easy, quiet life not to marry an Adams. They are headstrong, willful, fighting ever, but honest and brave and straightforward. It was a sentiment her husband's, Charles Francis Adams' mother, Louisa, and grandmother Abigail had felt over and over again, so it was fun to see them in Abigail Brooks Adams' letters as well. There's such a freshness here, an immediacy that you get from these letters without losing any of the actual news. It really is the full sweep of life. And I think that in some ways, it's a life that kids can connect with a lot better because it's so much more familiar than documents. And I mean, documents are terribly important. I'm on the board of the archives. I'm pro-document, but put me down. But the fact is that they can be very dry. They can be fascinating and they can be really interesting if well presented, particularly if they are in handwriting. But they can be dry, and the dates and the wars and all of that. These stories are stories. That's what his story is all about. And so I think that it makes it something where they can see the feelings and frustrations of the people who went before them. And that's particularly true not only in the letters, but especially true in the diaries. And I just think that they are wonderful, wonderful sources of history. One unpublished diary of a woman in Washington in 1861 who was just living there just fell happily into my hands when I was writing this book. She lived at Rosedale, an estate in Cleveland Park, Washington. It was a working farm. She was a widow in her 60s. Two of her daughters were in Virginia with her grandchildren. She was completely cut off from them and very concerned about them. And then a whole lot of the rest of her family lived with her, and she was having a great deal of trouble getting them to be sensible. And she said, the whole district is filled with spies. Every word is caught up and reported to the powers that be, and individuals are marked for vengeance. It is a complete reign of terror. She was, a secessionist sympathizer, and she said angrily, a man shot in his own door by a troop of 4 or 5 men for expressing secession sentiments. So she was desperately trying to keep her own children to shut up. And she says their insistence on the right of independence of speech was dangerously unwise. I only asked the common sense of silence. Now, any teenager would get that. I mean, I think that's something that they could relate to. This is not something their parents are the first to ask. Their parents might be saying, don't put it up on your Facebook page, but in this case, or Instagram, I guess, but you can see it dating back and being very vivid in this very dangerous and interesting and exciting period. There's another woman's diary that I used when Steve and I wrote a book back in 2000 about marriage, and this was a woman who, it's not as relatable, but it's just so delightful. Her name was Mary Richardson, and she was born in 1811 in Maine. And she decided as a woman at that point in history that she wanted to be a missionary to the Indians, to the Native Americans. And she discovered that she couldn't be a missionary unless she got married. And so she kept interviewing prospective mates. And her diary is just a riot about them. They dress badly, they don't, all of that. But then she finally picked out one. And another suitor told her that people did not think I was cutting a great cheese with her choice, but she married him anyway in 1838. Elkanah Walker was his name. And they went on to Missouri, which was the gateway to the West, and then they go by covered wagon to Oregon. And she's, of course, pregnant right away. So off they go to Oregon. It takes 129 days to get there. Of course, just through rutted roads and all of that, pregnant. And soon there are a couple of children. And she's happy. She's happy teaching the Indians. She's able to do what she came to do. She says, I gave them a lesson in geography on an eggshell, which I had painted for a globe. And she's very busy. One day she says, I dipped 19 dozen candles. You know. But here's my personal favorite. Rose about 5 o'clock, got my housework done up about 9, baked 6 more loaves of bread. 9 o'clock p.m. was delivered of a son. Now, I think that's pretty much the equivalent of a tweet, and it tells the story very nicely. You get it. You get the whole thing. Now, and actually, that gives me great hope in terms of our current history, because the truth is that with emails and all of that, it is now written down. And so you can have family history in a way that you couldn't about 20 years ago when everything was on the telephone. And I'm not saying these are brilliantly written emails and tweets and all of that, but they exist unless you try to erase them. And so families can put together what's happening. And it's particularly true when somebody's going off to college or getting married or somebody's died. You find that there's a lot of family stuff that you write about in those times. And if you can print it out and remember that, it does provide a little family history. But this business of trying to erase history is hardly new. And I mean, we know of Martha Washington famously burning all of her correspondence with George, but it's also true that when women started to think that they might be important, they were as bad as men. And when novelist and journalist Margaret Bayard Smith chose to include a very much pleased Dolly Madison in the National Portrait Gallery of Distinguished Americans, Dolly told her nieces to send her old friend, Mrs. Smith, just their letters from her, just their letters from Dolly Madison, the ones she had written once she realized that she was important. And so she had started editing her letters in the same way the men did. And so she said, do not send them, my letters, to your mother, because they are unvarnished opinions and feelings on different subjects. So she understood what she had done and what she was trying to erase. But what she did do in those letters is quite interesting and wonderfully preserved by the Dolly Madison digital edition, which my friend Holly Schulman has up and going at the University of Virginia. But we find out in those letters that that, for instance, the French ambassador to Washington, when Madison was Secretary of State, beat his wife. And she said, I've heard sad things of Thoreau, that he whipped his wife and abused her before all the servants. Now, women cared about those things, and a time when the men really didn't, and they found them worthy of chronicling. And unlike in his public statements, it was a very frank Secretary of State, James Madison, who outlined the foreign affairs situation to Dolly, who was briefly, they were together so much that we don't have much of their correspondence, but she was briefly in Philadelphia being treated because, the doctors were in Philadelphia. But she was desperate for news, and he says, if a general war takes place in Europe, Spain will probably be less disposed to insult us, and England less sparing of her insults. Whether a war will be forced by either is more than can be foreseen. The power, however, of deciding questions of war and providing measures that will make or meet it lies with Congress, and that is always our answer to the newsmongers. So he was telling her talking points for the press, and even though he was telling her the truth. And of course, the press, the newsmongers were everywhere. And of course, they were making it up 90% of the time. It's another thing people say to me is it worse? Are people nastier than they ever were before? Are you kidding? You know, the 18th, early 19th century press? You know, it's remarkable that the First Amendment was ever written. And I mean, at one point, Thomas Jefferson was accused in the Federalist Press of pimping Dolly Madison and her sisters in exchange for votes in Congress. And the Republican press said that when John Adams had Charles Cotesworth Pinckney as his running mate, that Pinckney had come home from London with 4 women, 2 for him and 2 for Adams. And Adams says, if it's true, I got cheated, you know. So it was always bad, but now what's so wonderful to us, God love modern technology as much as it makes you crazy. The press of the 19th century is completely available to us now online. And I think as a teaching tool that this is just one of the most wonderful things that I have ever seen. You know, you can go to newspapers.com or to Chronicling America, which is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and on the Library of Congress website. So newspapers cost some money, chronicling is free. And you can pull up stories about anything that happened in the 19th century. And they are just wonderful. They're so interesting. The New York Times has its entire archive online. So you can find any story from the time the New York Times started being printed in the, you know, sort of 1840s, 30s, 40s, till now on the website. And the papers were so incredibly entertaining. I mean, people wrote in ways that we would not be allowed to do today. In the midst of all the turmoil over the Kansas Constitution and Kansas being admitted, in the lead up to the Civil War, one Washington hostess decided to take a page from Dolly Madison's book and make the warring factions come together at a party, which was a very useful tool. And it was Mrs. Gwynn's ball, and everybody in Washington was extremely excited about it. And it did distract the debaters and attract all sides for a bit, and it was talked about for years to come. People would refer back in the early 20th century to Mrs. Gwynn's ball. And when the big night came, the New York Times reported that a dozen senators cordially fraternized and appeared to be ignorant that such a place as Kansas existed. He said they gathered in the study of Senator Gwynn. Guelphs and Ghibellines, radicals and fire eaters fraternized cozily and seemed to forget that they had recently been shivering lances on each other's reputation in the senatorial arena. It was also a costume ball, and so the women's costumes were described in detail. Mrs. Douglas's Aurora, the vivacity and esprit of Mrs. Davis's Madame de Stael, and the show stealer was Mrs. Clay, who kept a crowd around her throughout the evening as Dame Partington. So they're really fun to read. I'll give you this description of the day the midget Tom Thumb got married in New York. This is also a New York Times story. There were more than 20,000 women in this city yesterday morning, up and dressed an hour and a half before their usual time, solely and simply because of the approaching nuptials. They didn't all have cards of admission, but oh no, it wasn't their fault. Fathers were flattered, husbands were hectored, brothers were bullied, and cousins were cozened into buying, begging, borrowing, in some way or other, getting tickets of admission to the grand affair. The newspaper devoted 3 columns to the wedding, which was staged by Barnum in New York's Grace Church, and then there was a grand reception at the Metropolitan Hotel where the wedding party was put up on top of the piano to greet the guest, and then the streets were just thronged with people. The police had trouble keeping order. And then they ended the 10-hour party up on the balcony, blowing kisses to everyone below. and off they went. Well, my excuse for writing about this, I just loved it, of course, so I found any excuse. But my excuse was the next day they went to the White House and were received by President and Mrs. Lincoln. Phew, I was able to get Tom Thumb into the story. And they were in the East Room, and also there at the reception were some women journalists who are also part of my story in Capital Dames. So I was able, it was a good excuse for me to tell the wonderfully delightful story of Tom Thumb's wedding. But you know, there are all kinds of ways to use that story. There are ways to use it as how we saw differently abled people at that time versus this time. Talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, all kinds of things. And my biggest challenge, of course, was that I found these newspapers so fascinating that I could waste an entire day just sitting and reading them, because it's not just the stories, but all the ads are there, and they're a hoot. And so I think that it's one of the ways to really, really bring history alive, is to look back and see those things and find ways to use them that engage these kids and make it relevant, because so much of it is fun, and you know that. I mean, I know you spend much of your lives preaching that and trying to make it as fun as you humanly can, because history is stories, and stories are fundamentally fascinating. And the women's stories, I would argue, are the most fun and fascinating of all. So thank you for letting me share a few of them here with you today, and I'd be delighted to take any questions. Thank you very much. Go ahead. The women's suffrage movement is, so the capital, so I glance at it, both in Ladies of Liberty and in Capital Dames. And the end of Capital Dames, very much, that's the end, it's Grant's inauguration, and the couple of weeks before his inauguration was the first meeting of the National Women's Suffrage Party in Washington. And it was their 20th anniversary from Seneca Falls. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, at the end of a war where 600,000 Americans were killed, said that she thought that it had proved that men really couldn't do this. And so, but there's several places along the way during the war. The women were asked to stop during the war. But there's several places along the way where they organized. They were very active in organizing a petition to be signed by women of America promoting the 13th Amendment, but to end slavery. This is not on suffrage. And they were able, Sumner gave them the franking privilege, and they were able to collect about 400,000 signatures, and they were credited with helping push it through the Senate. But they're not in Washington, and the book focuses on Washington, but they're not left out, you can be sure. It's me, you know.
Hi, Edwin Grosvenor from American Heritage.
Hi.
It
Probably
seems-
can pull that microphone up so you don't have to.
Well, I was going to.
Oh, okay, all right, that's nice.
It seems like the only thing that the congressional Republicans and Obama administration can agree on is killing every federal program relating to history. We've lost the Teaching American History grants has been devastating, of course. Save America's Treasures, Preserve America, NEH, We the People, and of course the scenic byways and heritage areas and NHPRC, they're all endangered species. And I wondered if you just had any, with all of your connections in the political world, had any thoughts about prospects in the future for...
See, you never knew that you would live to really mourn Bobby Byrd, because that's what happened. You know, he was the person who pushed it and pushed it and pushed it, and you know, and Constitution Day and all of that, and it is at a time of sequestration It is very hard to get federal funding for anything, and I don't see, I would not hang my hopes on federal funding. I would be looking for other sources.
Who's against the Star Spangled Banner restoration?
Well, the Star Spangled Banner's been restored. It's nicely restored. It looks beautiful. In my view, it's one of the few, well, I'm not going to say that publicly. But they do a good job of showing the Star Spangled Banner at the American History Museum, and they do occasionally a wonderful, they have a Mary Pickersgill reenactor come and talk about making the flag. Nobody's against it. It's a question, you know, it's like everything else. It's a question of priorities. Now, some people do seem to be against AP history, as you might have noticed, but I think that you know, that when you have food stamps being cut, you lose liberal support for history being funded. That's where you are. So I would definitely look for other sources of funding.
Of all the women in American history, which one would be your pick to be the replacement for Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill?
That's a great question. Well, I guess Dolly, but you know, but I'm so grounded in that federal period. So I'm probably being unfair. We probably should include somebody like Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But what Dolly Madison was so important was that in the time right at the beginning when the partisanship and regionalism started immediately after the ink was dry on the Constitution, she made people come together and behave, and she did it for decades. I mean, she was so admired and honored, even in her poverty-stricken old age, that she really did have the ability to keep people from becoming as contentious as they would have been otherwise. And I think she did it at a time when the country could have easily fallen apart. And I don't think it's an accident that things got much worse after she died in 1849. No.
Everyone should sign the petition.
Thank you, first of all, for so much of what you do
Thank you.
in history.
Thank you for what you
and
do.
news. My question, I'm from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation,
Uh-huh.
Lisa Hubel.
You're doing great work. You need to fund all these people.
Well, thank you. Believe me, we are working on it
I know
in
you
our
are.
programming. But I would just like to ask, as a coda to everything that you've said, how do we help to inspire young women today?
Well, you know, what the data shows, actually, in terms of voting, is that when people learn how hard it was to get the vote, it inspires them to vote. And that's true both among women and African Americans. The rock the vote and all that kind of stuff tends not to have much of an effect. But when people are told how hard people worked to actually get the vote, and you're just going to sit there at home filing your nails, you know, it actually does get people's attention. So I think the stories do inspire them. And I think that having them recognize themselves in history inspires them, because it's very disempowering to be left out of history. And I think that that's a big inspirational force. It's one of the main reasons that I write these books. This last book, I was really late on the deadline because we had some family tragedies last year, and I got up, and I'm 71 years old. I got up at 3 o'clock every morning and wrote until 6 o'clock every night to finish that book. Now, that's because I want to inspire young women, so, you know, it's...
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us. My question relates to women at the founding. A lot of time when we talk about how they influence history, it's through influencing their husbands. And would you talk about if there's examples of women who have their own agency and not because of their position of who they were married to,
Right.
that they had a significant impact on how our nation was formed.
Right. It's a very good question. Of course, women were not particularly in a role to have much agency, but I would certainly argue that Mercy Otis Warren had an impact, and Judith Sargent Murray had an impact. And from abroad, Mary Wollstonecraft, where the men are all hysterical about the women reading her. Oh, she's a real Wollstonecraftian, you know. And you see in George Washington's very carefully saved account books that Martha read her, you know, all of that. So I do think that so I think that there were women whose political ideas were the ones that the men paid attention to. And I think that was particularly true of Mercy Otis Warren when the men were meeting in the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And she was back in Boston writing, saying, look, this is what the British are doing here. And it had an effect of bringing the colonies together in a way that might not have been true with the lack of communication and all of that. And the men asked her to write poems and plays attacking the British to rev up everybody in an anti-British view. So I think she had her own agency. I think Murray's view of women's empowerment had some tiny impact. You know, you have to start somewhere. And she was very pushy about getting the men to endorse her work and all of that. And then, of course, there were women who were soldiers and spies, and they're fab, and the children love learning about them. You know, in this children's book, there's a sweet little picture because it's exactly, the illustrator's wonderful, Diane Good. She's just fabulous, and she did all kinds of research herself. And but she pictured Lydia Dara just the way I picture her, on horseback with hair streaming behind her, you know, going through the night. But the children loved learning that she was stopped by the British and that they said, we need to search you. Wait, we need a woman to search you. And I say, it's kind of like the airports today, you know. And while she was waiting to be searched, she memorized the message she was taking to General Greene and swallowed it. I mean, it doesn't get better than that, you know. And then they searched her, and there wasn't anything, and off she went. So there are women who play those kinds of roles. But I would not diminish the role of women who influence the men, because I think that remains today a very important role. I would argue that the most powerful woman in America always is the First Lady. I would like someday for that to be the president, but it's still the First Lady, because influencing the most powerful man in America is still more powerful, and she has more influence than a female Secretary of State does. No, so, no.
Your last answer raised so many questions, I better be quiet. I write about a 20th century woman, Shirley Chisholm,
Right.
who is on the campaign for the $20 bill. But
Right, good.
That's not what I'm speaking
I'm very
about.
pro-Shirley.
But-
I knew her well, and she was a really fabulous human being.
Well, be careful, because I may want to interview you about that. But my question really dovetails to one of the first questions, and that is I teach at Brooklyn College in the School of Education, and I did a paper called Clio in the Curriculum. And in the New York State Regents, there are approximately 1 or 2 questions every 3 years on the Regents exam, and they always deal with either women's suffrage or something about post-1945 feminism. Usually about 7 women are mentioned in the Regents exam, and those of us who are teaching in the schools know quite often, and very unfortunately, if it's not on the test, it's not taught.
Right.
And I think that this is a concern that we all face. I do have one question for you. With your books and your connections in Washington, and you have a number of women in Congress who are incredibly sympathetic, to what extent can they help you get your books in the schools? Because that's another issue of getting books about women into the public schools so that the teachers
They
can use
can't.
them.
I mean, you know, you well know, it's not a federal thing of what goes into the schools. And, It's really, that's a teacher thing. I mean, I know some states have very strict rules, but many teachers tell me that they do use my books in their classrooms. I wrote them very specifically to be completely accessible to young people. I actually almost didn't tell Louisa Catherine Adams' story about the orphanage because I thought maybe teachers would think that was too sexy, but I couldn't resist. I very much wrote them with girls and boys in mind. You know, one of the things that makes me crazy with the children's book, people would say to me, well, I don't have any grandsons. Well, you know what? I mean, granddaughters. You know what? The boys can read about women. Women read about men all the time. It's not a problem, but it's a mindset. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ayana Najuma. I come from a background of a story that is not told and
Right.
speak to the issue, and that's the civil rights movement and the sit-in movement. I was one of the original sit-inners in Oklahoma City, and people don't tell that story. But when you talk about women and the role they play in society, how do these history teachers start to empower young people who are now African American and Hispanic students in most of the public schools, and help them understand that they played an important role as women and what that role was?
Well, I think, again, to the degree that you can find the stories, and it's very hard. As you well know, even getting a family history is hard. And so to the degree that you can find the stories and tell them, I think they're very important. And, one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of St. Augustine, here is this fabulously historic, oldest city, and you would think at a time when the country is increasingly Hispanic, that this would be something that we would be talking about a lot, because telling the story that this has been, that you've been in America forever, and I think is a great story to tell. So I do think that just to the degree that you can find the stories, tell them. Now, when you're talking about the 1960s, I don't know, you're in the classroom, I'm not. But when I was a student, you'd run out of time before you got to, in my case, before you got to World War I. So I suspect that there's some of that people don't consider it history, because it was in their lifetimes and they consider it, current events, or at least to me it's current events. To you all, it's probably history. But I think telling your own story is tremendously important. They actually do a pretty good job at the American History Museum of talking about the sit-ins. And they have a counter. They have the counter from Greensboro. And they do.
And that's why I'm here, because I'm here with Julia Clifford, who is telling the story of the Oklahoma City sit-in movement, and that happened 2 years before Greensboro.
Right.
I was one of those original sit-inners, and I was 7 years old, but
Wow.
people don't know that story.
Right.
But I think the beauty of all these fabulous history teachers, for me, is the same question that the previous person asked in terms of how you get stories told and how you get publishers to publish books about things that we never hear about, is the power that you history teachers have.
Right.
In terms of saying, I can't tell the story if I don't have the books and the information, even though the history is what it is the truth. So first I wanted to thank you for all the work you do, but I want to encourage these history teachers to be as powerful as you are, because you're the ones that are molding those young minds to understand that they are valuable and they are empowering and that they do have a voice in the 21st century. So thank
Good
you
message.
so much.
Thank you. And bravo to you for being a brave 7-year-old.
Well, that was my parents. I did that for 7 years, so I encourage people to come by our booth, and we're going to do a workshop tomorrow and talk about that, and I'd love to talk to you about more of the work that you do.
That's great.
So
Congratulations.
my hat goes off.
Thank you, and to you.
Hi, my name's R.C. Chapa. I'm with the University of New Mexico. I'm the director of the Center for Regional Studies, and part of our mission is to create new sources of knowledge about New Mexico through digital media. And earlier you were talking about don't count on federal funding, don't count on any of that. So those of
I
us-
say this as a person who's been in public broadcasting
Yes.
for 30 years.
Yeah, right. Well, I've worked for PBS for many years as a broadcaster and as a filmmaker, and so I'm entrusted by the university to create digital documentaries, 5-10 minutes. But I also have to write a bill for the legislature to ask them to support this endeavor. What message can you give us all who might have to do the same thing about why history? Why is it important
Well,
for us
I
to
mean,
teach?
again, as I said at the beginning, I don't think that you can understand the present without understanding the past. And I think that I think that the message I would give politicians is it actually makes people much better Americans and more patriotic, frankly. I mean, when we started recently at the archives where I'm on the board, we started sleepovers. Now, can you imagine sleeping on the marble floor in front of the Declaration of Independence? I mean, I think it's just nuts. But we have a waiting list a mile long from all over the country. Those kids go back home so imbued with the story of America that it is just exciting. And I think that you can do the same thing with the story of New Mexico. And again, you know, we're at a time when the Hispanic population is growing so exponentially that, you know, telling that story and telling the New Mexico story, I think is very important. I wouldn't leave out Catherine Drexel, by the way. She came through, you know, yes, she was a nun who came through and very, very insistent on teaching Native Americans and African Americans. She founded Xavier University in New Orleans, the only African American Catholic school in the country, which is a wonderful, wonderful school. But she was in New Mexico for quite a few years.
Well, they're asking us in New Mexico to go digital direction rather. They're not going to.
Digital is great.
Yeah.
It's great. Look, digital means we can all have access to it wherever it is. I mean, the difference in writing this book in 2014-15 and writing Founding Mothers that came out in 2004 was not just the difference in the periods, which were I mean, the later period is easier, obviously, but the difference in what's accessible online. The historical societies are putting things online, the Library of Congress is putting things online, the universities are putting things online, and even if they don't have it online, they can scan it and get it to you. I mean, it has really been considerably easier on the old body instead of having to travel places to get the information. So,
Thank you.
thank you. Okay,
Last question.
okay.
Well, as a male, therefore with
Oh, yeah.
pompous rhetoric, I
We'll forgive you.
say thank you for antagonizing the notion that academia is the place where one does history. You are a great example of someone really, as I used to say to my students, who does history. And too often we have those colleges, universities.
Well, they do great
in a
work, but
sense,
thank you.
Yeah, monopolizing. Secondly, as much as I admire your work, I wonder what you think of, let's say, the shades of gray culture or phenomena. In other words, your work gets out to what women, what class of women, et cetera. And I think in many ways I find our culture regressing vis-a-vis, you know, the women's movement.
Oh, I don't
Some
think that's
thoughts.
true. First of all, I mean, I have daughter and daughter-in-law in their 40s, and I don't see any regression, and I'd be careful. But more than half of our college graduates are female. 2/3 of our graduate school graduates are female. There can't be regression because there are not enough of you guys to go around. And so I think that I think that it's not the same kind of spirit, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, what we fought so hard for was for these women to have choices. and to be able to figure it out in ways that work better for them than it might have worked for us. So I don't despair at all. I think that they are a great group. I think that if they know their history, they're a better group. No.
If
So-
they know their history.
Yeah,
I
well,
mean,
we're
that's the
getting,
point. I mean, whether-
we're doing our best here. So, and you all are doing
Thank you very
yeoman
much.
work, and I'm very grateful to
Thank
you for doing it. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Enjoy the exhibit hall and the lunch in the exhibit hall.